All right, I'm going to be talking about Combat Blade, most notably on the Zealot. Yeah, me going over pretty much everything you could ever need to know on the Combat Blade, including modifiers, Curio Blessings take, perks, blessings, builds, and also what range weapon I recommend with the Combat Blade. To start off with the modifier. First target and finesse will be your most valuable modifier on the combat blade. Those are what influence the damage the most. And in my experience, first target is even more impactful than finesses, but both are considered equally important, so you're going to want both. Penetration. Penetration isn't considered a rending buff, it's just a damage buff against flak and carapace. So even with something like Uncanny Strike, you will still feel that damage loss in game if you use penetration as a dump stat. So I don't really recommend dumping that either. That leaves damage and mobility. Damage is the least impactful damage buff of the three with finesse and first target. But in between that and mobility, and my testing in the Psychanium, was quick testing of Psychanium, damage was about 40. There's between 60% and 80% damage. There's about 40 damage on a heavy attack in my testing. If that matters to you, then go ahead and dump mobility. Because mobility, doesn't matter really how low you go with it, you will still keep your 5 dodge charges. But dodge distance and sprint speed go down. Sprint speed and dodge distance is really fun to have, especially if you're not going an inexorable judgment build, then you may want to consider keeping mobility. But regardless, damage and mobility both work as a dump stat. Alright, Curios. Curios, I always recommend running at least 1+3 stamina. Then you go with your choice of 2 health, 2 toughness, or 1 health or 1 toughness, or even 2 stamina if you want to. Toughness is probably the better choice overall, with the toughness DR available to Zealot, and the toughness percentage you get back from talents like Second Wind. But health, as we all know, gives more overall than toughness does, because you have more health and toughness overall. And this is affected by stuff like the cheat death percentage heal, and it also helps with corruption damage as well. And let's say if you get overheaded by a mauler, which I guess shouldn't happen often, but shit happens. 2 health cures will actually help you survive that without dying, but that's very niche. But just really to get my point across of how health can help you over toughness. It's up to you. 2 health, 2 toughness. Really any of it will work as long as you have at least 1+3 stamina curio. Now, in terms of perks, I always recommend combat ability regen, +3 for all curios. If you're running the charge, then it's basically be double value for the charge, since since you have 2 casts of it, both those casts will be affected, go down to what, 26 seconds. So that's basically double value for combat ability regen. And for the last 2, I recommend a combination of stamina regen, gun efficiency, and gunner resistance, 2 of each. Now, it's up to you if you want to drop something like gunner resistance for even more stamina or sprint efficiency. I personally run 2 of each, and I think these 4 perks overall are just the best you can run for Curios. When I don't have gunner resistance, I usually find myself struggling with gunners. They're usually the cause of my downs if I don't have it, so my preference is to have 2 of it, along with 2 sprint efficiency, 2 stamina. Alright, perks. As for perks, I always recommend unyielding on every knife, no matter what build. Knife doesn't really struggle too much with breakpoints as much as other weapons, so unyielding for that boss damage value. as well as bulwarks. It's a bit too valuable to give up, in my opinion. The bossing is a really big thing that knife does really well. I also recommend running, if you're doing any sort of bleed build, which I'll cover a bit later in this, I do recommend flak since damage over time, damage usually sorry, it affects the body of the enemy. So let's say you're fighting a dread gunner or one of those flak armored basic mobs, then your damage over time from bleed will affect their body, which is flak. So you get a lot more extra value out of that. All right. For crit chance, I don't think it's particularly needed for most builds. There is like one or two build I'll cover later, which will use it, but I don't think it's as important as getting a flat damage increase against other enemies. But it isn't a bad if you're gonna get stuck with it as a locked, which I guess won't be too much of an issue in the next 2 or 3 weeks, then yeah, it's perfectly fine perk to run if you prefer it. Unarmored perk. Now this one, if you're running something like Uncanny, which doesn't affect Unarmored, and having the Unarmored damage perk will let you one-shot Dread Gunners, provided you have enough damage stacked up, like with Sustained Assault and a Duelist, then you can watch out Dread Gunners, which can be a pain in the ass and pretty annoying to deal with since you need to hit them twice. But it is one point that's really good. And using Unarmored is definitely a really good way to go. Weak spot and crit damage. Now typically these are bad on most weapons, but since it only affects the extra weak spot damage or crit damage on the weapon and not the actual base damage as well. But since Dagger's finesse scaling is so high, crit damage and weak spot damage is really good to have. Typically I say if you have over 50% crit, then you go crit damage, and if you have under 50%, then it's better to go weak spot. Elite is a really solid option. You cover scab gunners, I'm pretty sure every elite in the game. I don't know if it's too important for any breakpoints. I don't think it is, but 10% damage bonus against elites is never a bad thing. Lastly, sprint efficiency is an option if you don't really care. If you're not running Uncanny with Unarmored, so you're running like Precognition or something. And sprint efficiency is just something if you want to sprint around more. It does feel really nice to have, but it's not really necessary. It covers all the perks that I'm talking about. All right, now blessings. I'll go over each blessing pretty briefly, and then I'll go into combinations for actual builds after this. Starting off with Executor, this would be good, except for the fact that it falls off if you miss a weak spot. And the buff itself is a very short timer. I think it's like 2 seconds or something. Regardless, it's very short. If you're clearing a horde or something, you're light attacking into it, especially if you're using something like the Keep Swinging mod, then your light attacks will pretty much always be missing a weak spot as you're hitting into a horde. And the value falls even more because of that. Now, even without that mod, I know not everyone uses it. It's just there are much better options than Executor because it's just very consistent. It's really hard to get value out of compared to the other blessings. Haymaker, not much to talk about. It's not worth taking. Even on Mark 6, it's not really bothered. Mercy Killer, it does have a place. It's typically outshined by Uncanny Strike, but it does have a place specifically for bossing, killing bosses, and it can be better at killing crushers too. But the issue is just getting that bleed on them and then getting value out of Mercy Killer for all the basic enemies. It is good for hordes. I'll give it that as well. It's pretty good for hordes, but going a typical bleed build, just show after this, is probably just a better option anyway. But Mercy Killer is still a good blessing at the end of the day. Riposte is probably the top blessing overall for knife in my opinion. More crits means if you're running 50% DR on crit, if you're running the Invocation of Death, And just to get your Scourge stacks up to 70% if you're running Judgment, which you will be if you ever post, and then it just does everything you need it to do. You hit breakpoints a lot easier, you get more crit, and it lasts for 6 seconds. I know Duelist lasts for 3, but Riposte, it just lets you sustain those crits in that DR a lot, just much easier. Smackdown is basically Riposte if it was bad and not worth taking, so don't bother. Flesh Terror is pretty great if you're running it with Riposte, or if you're running it with a Piety build. Since bleed, put flak on it, dealing with basically most enemies in the game is a lot easier. Boards, it makes things a lot cleaner too, which is really satisfying. Be hitting into a mixed sword and just having them all drop to bleed. Onto Lacerate. Lacerate does have a place on the knife. With a blessing combination I will cover a bit later. Has a similar playstyle to Flesh Terror. And it isn't bad at all. It is not bad. It is a bit different. It is a bit different in the way you play it, but I'll cover that a bit later. It does have its place. Precognition, probably up there with Riposte, for in the top 3 blessing, with Uncanny Strike, which I'll talk about. Precognition, the 6% finesse damage applies to the weak spot and the crit damage, so it's basically double value. It is kind of just a better Mercy Killer in a way, because Mercy Killer only applies to weak spot, Precognition does weak spot and crit damage. But Mercy Killer is probably overall easier to use, because at the end of the day, you won't have Duelist up all the time. You won't have Precognition up the entire time of the game. And the times you don't, well, you're losing value out of it because, well, you don't have Precognition up, you don't have Duelist up. Using something like Mercy Killer will still let you get value out of those times you don't have all of your buffs up from dodging. So you can't proc the dodge off everything like gunners. You can't proc dodge off of that, snipers, etc. Or just if stuff isn't aggro on you. Ruthless Backstab, which is worse Uncanny. It doesn't have any throwing knife or damage over time utility anyway, so that's not really worth using either. Lastly, Uncanny. We all know it. It's up there, top 3 with Precog and Riposte, of course. It enables your damage over time effect, do more damage than most mobs. Uncanny affects Carapace, Flak, Maniac, and Unyielding. To varying degrees, it affects Flak and Carapace more than Maniac and Unyielding, but it's still something that's worth taking into consideration. Your damage over time will do more damage to all types of enemies, most important being Flak, of course. Your throwing knives will be given rending, so you can use it to finish off Maulers and Crushers. And it opens up a lot of builds to do a lot better than typically would be, most notably the bleed builds I'll cover in blessing combinations. So to start off, most of these recommendations will be for an inexorable judgment build. I'll be covering Piety as well, but most of it will be the judgment. The reason why I think judgment is better is because the node comes right after sustained assault, which is a flat 20% damage increase. So you don't need to take the points to snipe it. So it saves you 2 points as opposed to something like Piety. And also has very good dodge buffs. Not everyone knows this, but it gives you, with 15 stacks, it gives you 7.5 dodge speed and distance. And the distance is really big on every build. If you look at attack breakdowns of a weapon, you'll see that dodges will be like -4, -6, or in Combat Blades plays up to 13%. So a 7.5% dodge distance is really big value on every weapon, not just Combat Blade. And the dodge reset time will be up by 15%. So if you're keeping track of dodges with like numeric UI or something, you notice that you have like 5 dodges, you go into the negatives. The 15% dodge reset time, your dodges will come back a lot faster, which is just a lot better survivability. You get to proc your dodge duelist buffs more, and yeah, it just really just boosts judgment up to be the best keystone of the two. Starting off with blessing combinations, my first recommendation will be, or I guess first two recommendations will be Riposte Precognition and Riposte Uncanny Strike. Starting off with Riposte Uncanny Strike, I recommend this because, again, you'll be getting those. This is a pretty small one, but Riposte with the Scourge stacks will be boosted a little bit by Uncanny. But Uncanny, again, is a lot easier to keep uptime with compared to Precognition in my experience. Precognition is a 2-second buff. You won't always have. Of course, you have good uptime with Riposte and Duelist in general over the course of a game. But again, it won't be up all the time. Uncanny just kind of makes up for that weakness. You can sustain it without needing to dodge. You can get you get good throwing knife value against Maulers, Crushers, and Reapers too, actually. You can two-shot Reapers with enough attacks. And it's a lot easier to use in Precognition. And since it applies to all four: Black, Carapace, Maniac, and Yielding, so it's overall easier to use. It's just as good as Precog, honestly. I think Riposte Precog is probably the overall best combination of the two. But Riposte Uncanny is still up there. And for a good amount of players, it may be better for them over Precognition. And for post precognition, of course, running this pretty much covers all of your bases with the actual when you actually have all the buffs up from dodging. You can one shot both types of gunners, shotgunners, of course. You can basically two-shot crushers, maulers, and it has really good boss damages. Although one issue I find is that this is with Uncanny too, but if you're not able to get the boss to aggro on you, the boss just pass you to someone else, then getting value out of this can be pretty difficult. But overall, do really good. Beast and Nurgle, where you just dodge some random enemy, then just do big damn to its back. And yeah. My third recommendation, again, an Inexorable Judgment build, will be Lace Rate and Uncanny. A lot of people look down on Lace Rate because, well, you need to get a non-weak spot hit for it to be activated, but this thing provides a lot of value with the synergy with Scourge. Lace Rate is basically free Scourge stacks. You'll be able to get up to 50% crit and maintain that for the majority of the game. This is more of a this build does use more light attacks than a typical non-bleed knife build. But the reason you run it over Flesh Tear or Post is because Uncanny will bleed the damage over time damage against all the four enemy types mentioned before. And it is a very comfortable build to run. You still get, even without the Duelist proc, which you will be taking advantage of with this build, you can still one-shot gunners, just not Dread Gunners, with Duelist proc. So you still be proactive with that. You have 50% crit for the most part because Scourge is so easy to upkeep with it. Clearing hordes will be very easy. You pretty much always have full Uncanny stacks and most bleed stacks on hordes in general. Although one weakness of the build is that it's a bit worse at bossing than a typical Riposte Uncanny build. But in some cases it can be better, like again, if the boss isn't burning, if you have a Taunt Ogren or something, then or we have like a Psyker using Smite throughout the game. If you have a lot of CC on the map, then Lace Rate and Uncanny can probably be the better choice over the other two blessings because you're not as reliant on getting those dodge procs throughout the entire game. And of course, with Uncanny, you still have the throwing knives against armor. Fourth blessing is Riposte Flesh Tear. Pretty easy to see this one. Riposte, you get the crit. Flesh Tear, you get Scourge stacks. You get a lot of crit with Flesh Tear. Really reliable. Only downside compared to the last one is that you don't get the Uncanny value bleed. So it is technically less damage, but very similar play style. Like if you're fighting a Dread Gunner, you stab it in the head, you can just leave it. You don't need an armor to kill it, the bleed will kill it. So you don't need to worry about the tankiness of direct gunners with their own heads. I prefer Lacer Uncanny, but this is a perfectly fine blessing setup if you want to run it. Just that armor will be a little bit more of an issue. Now for Piety builds, I'll be a bit more brief with this. Piety, instead of Lacer Uncanny, you do Flesh Tear Uncanny since you have the crit chance. Similar playstyle as the Piety instead of Double Judgment. Precognition and Uncanny. This one is actually really fun in my opinion. Basically, Piety acts as a riposte, so then you get Precognition and Uncanny. You still get the value from the throwing knives and armor damage. And you have Precognition just to deal super big damage. And this last build, or second to last build, Precognition Mercy Killer with Piety. Honestly, with Piety, it's probably better than running Uncanny. It'll be really, really good for boss killing. Piety will let you get the Scourge stacks on people if you really need to. Yeah, it's mostly just for bossing though. It's still really fun to run. I forgot to mention that Precognition and Mercy Killer are both still really good for giving hordes of mobs. And lastly, you can run Mercy Killer along with Flesh Tear, Lacerate, and Riposte in general. But I mostly just prefer Uncanny Strike. Recommend Uncanny Strike over Mercy Killer because Uncanny will have more value over the course of the game than Mercy Killer will, because it is a buff that applies to you. So you kill a mob and the Uncanny Strike will still carry over to the next kill. It's Mercy Killer, you need a bleed. You need to get a bleed on each mob first. It can be more difficult to get value out of it. But like I said, it still has its place with bosses. Alright, starting off with first build, it will be a charge build. It's mostly a generalist build. It'll work with pretty much most sellout weapons, but it's also just probably one of the best combat blade builds in my opinion, at least when charge is concerned. At the top of the tree, Anoint in Blood. This base range damage does apply to the Flamer, which in my opinion is the best range weapon to pair with Combat Blade Zealot, which I'll get to in a bit. I probably put some examples on screen of how good it is as well. Purge the Unclean, mostly for the unyielding enemies. So Infested works too. Like if again with Flamer, if you're dealing with Boxwalkers or Bulwarks, Flamer does pierce Bulwarks. So having that damage with Anoint in Blood helps you deal with Bulwarks with Flamer in general with Anoint in Blood, as well as, of course, you get more boss damage, which is one really big selling point of the knife. You get Thou Art Be Swift, which is overall full stun immunity, not just melee damage. Which is you're immune to shotgun knockback. The toughness break doesn't mess with you. Aspects is like getting stunned out, which is actually a pretty big value. I take this in pretty much every build. And again, if you're using Flamer, if you get hit by some Poxwalker, then if you don't have this talent, the Flamer will reset and you'll lose your Blaze Away stacks. So it's even better if you run actual. But even without Flamer, I recommend it for every build. It's just really way too good not to have. You get Cheat Death on this build as well. I know some people don't like doing it, but the fact that Cheat Death has a 2-minute cooldown is just really elevates it to be one of the best talents available to Zealot. You'll be times where you proc Cheat Death, you heal up to about 50-ish health, and then by the time you're in like some sort of danger again, where you're about to die, Cheat Death is already back up. I've had plenty times of that happening. Allows you to play a lot more aggressively, a lot more confidently. You have your situation, you're low health, but you have Cheat Death up, so you can afford to play a lot more recklessly, a lot more confidently, and use your health as a resource to keep going and play really aggressive. Second build I'll be showing is basically mostly revolves around the knife more than the Flamer. This one is a very fun build. I'm actually really warming up to this more so than the first one. You do lose Anointing Blood and Purging and Clean, so your Flamer does lose a lot of value. You still use Flamer, because at the end of the day, it'll still clear mixed swords very well for you. But the damage drop off will be very noticeable, especially if you've been using the first build for a while already, like I have. You will gain desperation over cheat death since you do need that extra talent point for invocation of death. I'm not a fan of desperation. If it worked like that one, the stamina blessing, where you get damage as your stamina drops, I think that'd be a lot better. But having to go to 0 stamina isn't really worth it in my opinion. I do it at times, like when I see opportunities, I will use desperation against like a boss or something. But overall, I don't think it's really worth the effort to do so for most people. Having that stamina, because stamina is basically like a lifeline, and running yourself out of that constantly isn't really practical in most scenarios. And at the bottom right, it takes with certainty instead of highest cutthroat, since you do get most of your CDR from invocation. You can take the backstab kills for ability cooldown, but the certainty is just really fun to use. And the as long as you know how it works with the, you need to run a gunners at like a certain angle. I think it's 70-degree angle to get that dodging while sprinting. And also you get the you get both plus 5% movement speed nodes in the tree as well. So if you compare this to the last build, you'll be running around a lot faster, which honestly just makes it really, really fun. This is my main build that I'm running now. I guess the first build is the build I run the most, but this second build, I've been warming up to it recently, and I'm just having a lot of fun with how fast you can go. So that's definitely another recommendation. Third build is typical stealth build. What I like about stealth is that you get all the nodes you need. You're not missing out on anything. You get the flamer, purge and clean, anoint and blood. You'll get good balance, which is true 25% DR, which is extremely good for survivability. And you'll be getting the Swiss Certainty and Retributor, which combination of all, the reason I go cheat death is because the charge build, you give up cheat death, you only get 1 extra talent point to put where you want. But for stealth, you get 2 extra talent points. So putting that in an area like good balance and Retributor stance, I think is more value than having cheat death itself, because just how much toughness you get back and how much DR you get in general. You're still free to get cheat death when you get rid of sprint speed and the retributors for cheat death. I've seen some people do that. Or you can get rid of the retributors and Swiss Certainty for the 10% attack speed. Although I prefer the just having the sprint speed and toughness. This is my main stealth build I run for the most part. It's also the one. These next 2 builds will be 2 variations of a stealth build with the Invocation of Death. The reason I don't recommend this is because I think you're giving up too much just for the sake of CDR and crit. For the charge build, you give up 3 talent points to reach Invocation, but for the stealth build, you need to spend up to 5 points to get to Invocation. So to go through, you're giving up Anoint and Purge, which is fine. You do that on the charge build. But if you go the Benediction route, you're giving up Thyroth Be Swift. For the stealth route, compared to the other stealth build, you're giving up good balance, with certainty, and Retributor. And somewhere along the line with these 2 builds, I personally don't believe that to be worth it. Having flamer damage, extra true damage reduction, sprint speed, and toughness regeneration, I just don't think that's worth it having more cast stealth. And what makes stealth so good already, if you're running combat Curio, combat regeneration, every time you press stealth, you're pretty much always going to have a free backstab kill, which will put your stealth at around 15 seconds. Usually it's 15 seconds for me. I'm at CDR Curios. Of course, if you have an Ogre or a Psychic on your team, then that CDR will be even lower. I don't think it's terribly necessary to go Invocation of Death to be casting stealth that much. You'll be getting tons of stealth casts already. with the free backstab kills you'd be getting as long as you're proactive with it. And you'd be getting backstab kills in general just by playing the game, clearing a horde, going behind a gunner that's shooting a teammate. Which I recommend the first stealth build I chose. These two are perfectly fine to run if you for that, which is why I'm putting them in the video in the first place. But it's not necessarily my recommended. And these last two builds will just be a stealth and charge variation for Piety. Piety, again, it's some people really prefer to run Piety, so I'm putting it in here. Now to talk about Flamer and Throwing Knife. And when I started out with knives, I ran the revolver the most part when I started out. At least revolver was my main weapon, but as I got better and better with throwing knives, I saw myself barely using my revolver at all. I hardly picked up any ammo packs around the map. Hardly. I mean, my friend liked it because he's a gun psycher. He loved having more ammo pickups to himself, but when it gets to the point where you need I thought about what weapon can I use to complement the build. And eventually I got to the Flamer, which is just, honestly, I think it's up there with Plasma Gun and Calmness Mark 5, Trauma 4 staff in terms of just how good it can be in the game. Honestly, I think it's a bit game breaking. I'm really surprised to be getting buffs. In this upcoming patch, we'll be getting even more buffs. So that's actually really cool. And the Flamer as well, there's a little trick you can do with it. This would be even better when they actually fix overpressure to apply the damage over time effects. You can sweep it around like in a very wide arc. As long as you tap the left click instead of holding it down, you just tap it between each sweep. I'll show an example on screen. But it's basically saves ammo and it's more burn damage across a bigger radius in front of you. The only downside is that one, it doesn't apply blaze. If you're using blaze away, it's not really worth doing in most cases, unless you're low on ammo. It can be worth doing. And it takes longer to do. Like if there's a big horde in front of you, big stacked mixed horde in front of you, there's no point in doing it. There's really not much point in doing it. I suppose it's only really if things are really spread out in front of you and you need to save some ammo. And I forgot to mention that Flamer is affected by attack speed. So even though the running buff is gone, using charge with it to increase the attack speed is really good. If there's mobs hitting you, you can use charge to stagger them while you're flaming. And inabsorbable judgment attack speed also affect Flamer, so you can get that damage out really, really well. As for Flamer perks, I always recommend Unyielding a Flak. Unyielding deal with bulwarks, that's like Flamer is your main answer against bulwarks, which is why I take Unyielding. And for the occasional Beast of Nurgle, if there's a huge mixed horde with the boss, you can't really get in there, then Flamers are really good just to clear out the entire mixed hordes, deal with the boss a lot easier. And of course, Flak, because most enemies have flak bodies, so it's just kind of a no-brainer pick there. But other picks work too, like reload speed or elite damage is perfectly fine. Yeah, if you get really good with throwing knives, the skill ceiling is really high, but in my opinion, it's worth it. It really brings out the best that Knife Select can perform. And lastly, Mark III or Mark VI. I'm going to go ahead and say that Mark III is probably the better one overall. Mark III is a better heavy attack pattern. The strike downs do have a higher finesse scaling than the Mark VI's Vanguard. Mark VI's strike down attacks do have the same scaling as Mark III, and you could say it has more variety to its moveset, and it has a faster push block attack. And the push block attack does do the same damage as that's really, really good. If this were a Psyker build, I would recommend Psykers run Mark VI actually, but I guess it's mostly personal preference anyway. But Mark III, if you're chaining special heavy attacks, like your special punch and heavy attack, it does it a lot, much faster. 6. And if you're dealing with big enemies like crushers, bosses, and bulwarks. You don't need to play around with the moveset as much. You'll notice if you're fighting a big enemy that Mark 6 has significantly harder time dealing with it than the Mark. But if you're running a Piety build like with Flush Terror, Uncanny, something like with Flush Terror or something, then Mark 6 can be really good. The light attacks do cover a big wider radius. So it's still like a perfectly fine option. But at the end of the day, I would prefer Mark 3. Just light easier to hit weak points with, get consistent weak points hits with. Oh yeah, one more thing about the Mark 3 is that the second heavy attack chains into the third light attack, which is a very quick stab that has a higher scaling than the other 3 attacks of the dagger. You can do that. This is a really good way of finishing off enemies like drug gunners, maniacs. If you want to build lacerate or just bleed stacks on Crusher with Flushter or lacerate, you can do that follow stab in their body with Uncanny. And it actually is a really efficient way of killing them with getting the Uncanny bleed stacks on them. So that's really good. I recommend people look more into that. I don't see enough people doing it and using it to their advantage. So yeah, that pretty much covers everything I want to talk about.